These aren't soldiers, they're butchers. What the Wehrmacht really thought about. The water rats. February 1944, Normandy. German officer Oberleutnant Kurt Meyer writes a phrase in his field diary that decades later would become a nightmare for historians trying to preserve the myth of a gentlemanly war. These aren't soldiers. These are butchers in uniform. They come at night, like rats from the sewers. We call them Wasserratten, water rats. Our men fear them more than the Russians. Meyer commanded the elite SS division Hitlerjugend, had seen the Eastern Front, had seen partisans, had seen everything, but he feared the Canadians in a special way. Because the Canadians didn't fight by the rules, they turned war into a hunt, and German soldiers into game. And this was only the first shock for the Wehrmacht. The nickname, quote, "2" didn't appear by accident. Canadian assault units specialize in operations under the most disgusting conditions. Flooded trenches of the Scheldt, swamps of Normandy, destroyed dams of Holland. Where Americans waited for engineers to pump out the water, Canadians moved forward waist-deep in freezing slush. Where the British demanded artillery preparation, Canadians attacked in complete silence with knives and sharpened entrenching tools. The Wehrmacht quickly understood, if you see a Canadian flag on the map, expect a nightmare at night. But where did these people come from? The answer to this question made German analysts grab their heads. Lumberjacks from British Columbia who felled trees in -30 degrees, fishermen from Newfoundland accustomed to working knee-deep in the icy waters of the Atlantic, miners from Alberta who crawled in darkness underground their entire lives, farmers from Saskatchewan who butchered pigs from age 5. These were people for whom cold, dirt, darkness, and physical pain were ordinary. The army didn't make them tough. The army simply gave them weapons and pointed at a target. The Canadian army didn't mass conscript like the American one. It took volunteers, people who chose war themselves. And a person who chooses war voluntarily fights very differently from one who is forced. German intelligence Abwehr compiled a dossier on Canadian units by the end of 1942. In a document found after the war in the archives, it stated, Canadian soldiers differ from American and British in psychological profile. Average age, 26 years, which is 4 years older than an American infantryman. Most have experience in heavy physical labor. Many grew up in isolated regions with harsh climate. It is recommended to avoid close combat. The recommendation was ignored, and it cost the Wehrmacht thousands of lives. However, the Wehrmacht's first encounter with Canadian fury turned out to be completely different from what German command expected. The first clash happened in August 1942. Dieppe, a catastrophic operation in which more than 3,000 Canadians perished in 9 hours. Historians call it a failure. Germans call it a nightmare, because even while dying, Canadians fought with such fury that Wehrmacht officers wrote reports about German Colonel Walter Haga wrote after the battle. It looked not like a battle, but like a slaughter they inflicted upon themselves. But the Germans made a fatal mistake. They decided the Canadians were broken. And the Canadians simply remembered the lesson, remembered every firing position, every weakness in German defense, every command mistake, and prepared for 2 years to return. When they returned, Dieppe didn't repeat, because now the Canadians knew how to fight Germans. And the Germans understood they had awakened something terrible. They returned. June 6, 1944, Juno Beach. While Americans were stuck at Omaha, losing thousands of men on the coastal strip, Canadians pushed 12 kilometers inland, farther than any other Allied contingent that day. The Wehrmacht expected Canadians to be cautious after Dieppe. Instead, they attacked with such aggression that German defense simply collapsed. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division lost 340 men killed on the first day, less than Americans lost every hour at Omaha. Why? Because Canadians didn't stop, didn't dig in, didn't wait for reinforcements, just moved forward and killed everyone who shot. The Canadian Scottish Regiment stormed into the village of Courseulles and carried out what German reports delicately call, quote, 6 surviving Unteroffizier Heinz Schulz later told, interrogating British, quote, 7. The piper of the Scottish Regiment, Private Bill Millen, played bagpipes under bullets the entire day of the landing. Germans didn't shoot at him specifically. They thought he was insane, and you don't kill the insane. Millen survived. Hundreds of Germans around him didn't, but the real horror began in autumn, and the Wehrmacht understood that Juno Beach was only a prelude to the real nightmare. the Battle of the Scheldt, the dirtiest, most brutal, most forgotten campaign of the Western Front. Canadians were given a task: clear the Scheldt estuary of German troops to open the port of Antwerp. Without Antwerp, the Allies couldn't supply armies stuck in Belgium and Holland. Without Antwerp, the war would drag on for another year. The problem? Germans flooded the entire area, blew up dams, opened locks, turned fertile lands into a chest-deep salt swamp. Canadians had to fight waist-deep in salt water under constant artillery fire against elite units of the 15th German Army, those same soldiers who held the Atlantic Wall for 5 years. American General George Patton, learning of the plan, said, quote, 8. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery supported Patton. Quote, 9. Canadian General Guy Simons replied, quote, 10. And what they did next exceeded the worst nightmares of the Wehrmacht, because Canadians didn't just attack through water, they turned water into a weapon. Regina Rifles, Canadian Scottish, Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, North Shore Regiment, these units turned the Scheldt swamps into a slaughterhouse. Germans dug in on dikes and islands, controlled every meter of dry land, built defenses they considered impregnable, minefields underwater, machine gun nests on elevations, artillery on islands impossible to reach without a fleet, snipers in church towers, wire stretched between posts underwater to cut the throats of those trying to swim across. German General Gustav von Zangen, commander of the 15th Army, was confident. The Canadians will drown before they reach us. Canadians attacked at night, swimming with camouflaged faces. They approached German positions silently, like real rats, and carried out massacres in trenches before the enemy understood what was happening. But this wasn't chaotic violence. This was surgically precise tactics developed by people who knew water better than Germans knew dry land. German Gefreiter Manfred Koch, captured after one such attack, gave testimony that Allied command classified for 30 years. Quote, 12. However, the smile wasn't the scariest part. The scariest was the system. The tactics were simple and terrible. Canadians studied the German system of guard rotation, learned when soldiers changed shifts, when they were most tired, when officers slept. Canadian intelligence worked flawlessly. Dutch partisans reported the location of every German post. RAF pilots photographed every trench, and Canadians turned information into corpses. They chose moonless nights. Moonless. Moved against the wind so dogs wouldn't smell them, smeared their faces with coal and swamp mud, left rifles at base, took only knives, grenades, and sharpened entrenching tools. The entrenching tool was the favorite weapon, silent, effective, pierced a helmet with one blow. German soldiers found bodies of their comrades with crushed skulls and began to understand fighting against them wasn't a regular army, but predators. Canadian sappers sharpened the edges of entrenching tools on whetstones to razor sharpness. One blow from above, the skull split. One blow from the side, the head came off. German Dr. Karl Schmidt, working in a field hospital, wrote in his diary, "Wounds from Canadian entrenching tools can't be confused with anything. These aren't combat wounds. These are executions. Precise, methodical, professional." But the predators were different. And some hunted alone. Germans especially feared Canadian snipers. Francis Pegamagabau, an Ojibwe Indian from Ontario, killed 378 Germans during World War I and remained Canada's deadliest sniper in history. During World War II, his nephew Tommy Prince, who became a legend of Canadian intelligence, continued the family tradition. Prince worked as part of special units of the 1st Canadian-American Special Service Force, which called themselves, quote, 14, but Germans knew them as, quote, 15. He could lie in ambush for 72 hours straight without moving, controlling his breathing, slowing his pulse, could crawl to a German officer at 3 meters distance and cut his throat while the adjutant stood 2 steps away smoking a cigarette. After the war, Prince received 9 combat awards, including the Military Cross and the American Silver Star. But in Canada, they were silent about him. An Indian hero didn't fit the official propaganda of white British Canada. But in German archives, his name appears in 23 different reports. Ghost with a knife, the one who comes in the fog, death in moccasins. German command announced a reward for his head, 10,000 Reichsmarks. No one ever received that reward because Prince survived and everyone who tried to catch him didn't. And snipers were only the scalpel. The real sledgehammer was assault groups that turned night into a weapon of mass destruction. Canadians developed tactics called Quote 19. The essence is simple. A group of 12 to 15 men penetrates German defenses at night without shots. First, go Quote 20, fighters specializing in silent elimination of sentries. They were trained in special camps where instructors from British commandos taught how to approach a person from behind, how to cover the mouth, how to break the neck with one movement, how to cut the throat so blood wouldn't spray on clothes. Behind them, demolition men with grenades and charges. They planted explosives under ammunition depots, under bridges, under headquarters buildings. Closing were cleaners, those who finished off the wounded and destroyed documents. In 45 minutes, such a group could wipe an entire strongpoint off the face of the earth without losing a single person and without firing a single shot. Germans called it Geistertaktik, ghost tactics. Canadians called it work. Private Joe Ogilvy from Regina Rifles told his grandson after the war, "We came, did the job, and left, like plumbers. Only instead of pipes, we fixed the front. A German broke, we removed him. Just work." This work during 1 month of October 1944 cost the Wehrmacht more than 3,000 soldiers who simply disappeared, didn't become prisoners, didn't desert, disappeared. German headquarters received reports. Strongpoint 17 isn't responding. They sent a patrol. The patrol found corpses, all sentries dead, all with slit throats. Ammunition depot blown up, documents burned, radio destroyed, no traces of attackers. But one man raised this work to a completely new level of madness and became a living legend, even among Canadians. Leo Major, the most famous water rat, worked solo entirely, a one-eyed French-Canadian from Quebec, 170 centimeters tall and weighing 68 kilograms, lost an eye from a grenade fragment in Normandy. Doctors wanted to discharge him. Major refused, said, "I only need one eye to aim." Returned to duty in 2 weeks, and in April 1945 single-handedly liberated the Dutch city of Zwolle from the German garrison. Single-handedly. A city with a population of 50,000 people. The German garrison numbered about 650 soldiers from the 91st Infantry Division and SS remnants. The city was strategically important. A supply road to northern Holland went through it. Canadian Command planned an assault with an entire battalion with artillery support. Major volunteered to scout positions. On the night of April 14th, he infiltrated the city alone with a Sten gun, grenades, and endless audacity. Started throwing grenades at different buildings a kilometer apart, shooting from the automatic weapon, running between streets, setting warehouses on fire, shouting orders to retreat in German, created the illusion that an entire battalion was attacking the city from different sides. Germans panicked, shot at each other in the darkness, fled north, abandoning weapons and equipment. Major pursued them, shooting at their backs, throwing grenades. By dawn, he had personally eliminated 93 German soldiers. The rest fled the city. Canadian intelligence entered the city and found Major sleeping on the town hall steps, hugging his automatic weapon. Around him lay empty magazines, shell casings, and grenade pins. The Dutch called it a miracle. Major called it a good night walk. Canadian Command offered Major the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He refused, said British General Montgomery was an incompetent fool, and receiving awards from him was humiliating. Right to an officer's face. Major was almost court-martialed, but the Dutch intervened, said this crazy one-eyed Canadian saved their city from destruction. Germans, learning this story after the war, called Major quote 31 the madman. He preferred the nickname quote 32 quote 33 . However, the question remained, why specifically quote 34 rats? And here began the darkest part of the story, because Canadians literally lived in water. The Scheldt was flooded. Germans blew up dams, turning Holland into a Venetian nightmare of mud and corpses. Water level reached 1.20 meters in some places. Water temperature in October to November about 4 degrees Celsius. Any person spending more than an hour in such water would get hypothermia. Canadians spent 12 hours a day in water, moved forward when water reached their necks, built floating bridges from planks, sandbags, and corpses, German and their own, slept in flooded foxholes, waking up every hour so as not to drown, tying themselves with ropes to posts, ate cold rations because lighting a fire in a swamp was impossible, smoked holding cigarettes above water in an outstretched hand. Most Canadians suffered from, quote, 35, gangrene caused by constant exposure of feet to cold water. Feet became white, swollen, skin peeled off in layers. Toes turned black and died. Some had toes amputated right on the battlefield without anesthesia, just chopped off with an entrenching tool, cauterized the wound with a red-hot bayonet, and sent back into battle. Medical records show more than 1,200 Canadians lost toes during the Battle of the Scheldt. They returned to duty in a week, limping, but with weapons in their hands. American war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who visited Canadian positions in October 1944, wrote a report that his editors cut in half because it was, quote, 36. The full version was published only in 1992, quote, 37. But the Wehrmacht wasn't going to surrender just like that, and the Germans tried to turn water into their ally. Germans tried to adapt, strengthen night patrols, now 6 to 8 men instead of 2 or 3, set mine traps in water, wooden boxes with explosives floating just below the surface, hung barbed wire between islands underwater at neck level to hang those who tried to swim across, set tripwires with signal flares, ordered soldiers to sleep in boots and with weapons in their hands. Useless. Canadians bypassed mines by diving under them and feeling the bottom with their hands. Sappers went ahead with long poles, feeling out mines and diffusing them underwater. Cut wire underwater, holding their breath for 2 to 3 minutes, a skill fishermen and divers learned from childhood. Killed patrols silently and took their uniforms to penetrate even deeper into German positions. There were cases when Canadians in German uniforms entered headquarters dugouts, cut officers right over maps, and left before anyone understood what happened. German Major Günter Kramer wrote in a report to command, "The enemy demonstrates inhuman endurance. We found bodies of Canadians who drowned clutching grenades and knives. They died but didn't release weapons. One Canadian was found dead, standing neck deep in water, frozen to a post he was hugging. In his hand was a knife under his feet, the body of our sentry. He killed the sentry, then died from cold, but didn't fall. This isn't an army. These are fanatics." However, it wasn't about fanaticism at all, but about cold calculation and understanding a simple truth. Canadians simply understood no one was coming to help them. Americans were fighting in the Ardennes, preparing to repel the last German offensive, and British were clearing Belgium and France, stretched along a 300-kilometer front. French were rebuilding their own army after liberation. The Scheldt was a Canadian war, a Canadian problem, Canadian blood, and they won it in the bloodiest way. During 40 days of fighting from October 1st to November 10th, 1944, 6,427 Canadians perished. Another 7,500 were wounded. This is 20% of all Canadian losses for the entire war in 40 days. Germans lost more than 12,000 killed and 41,000 prisoners. The math is simple. Each dead Canadian cost the Wehrmacht 2 killed and 6 captured Germans. This is the highest loss ratio on the Western Front. But the main thing, the spirit of the Wehrmacht was broken, and this was more important than any statistics. German soldiers began surrendering at the sight of Canadian uniforms, simply dropped weapons and raised hands when scouts reported, quote, 39 officers wrote reports about, quote, 40 and, quote, 41. In November 1944, the command of the 15th German Army issued a special order signed by General von Zahn, quote, 42. The order helped little because Canadians adapted faster than any orders, but even this didn't stop the Canadians. Moreover, they found a new target. They began hunting dogs. Service German shepherds were the last hope of German patrols. Dogs could smell Canadians from 100 meters, even against the wind. Canadians solved the problem simply, carried pieces of meat soaked in rat poison in their pockets, scattered them before attacks on patrol routes. German shepherds found the meat, ate it, and died in convulsions in 10 minutes. Patrols lost dogs and returned to base. By that time, Canadians were already clearing their positions. Some Wehrmacht units completely refused dogs after Regina rifles poisoned 18 service dogs in one night on a 5-kilometer front section. German veterinarian Helmut Franz, who serviced dog teams of the 15th Army, later admitted to British investigators, "Canadians fought not only against us, they fought against everything, nature, animals, logic. We thought water would stop them. Water made them stronger. We thought dogs would protect us. Canadians poisoned the dogs. We thought night gave us an advantage. Night became their ally. Whatever we came up with, they found a way to turn it against us." And what did the Canadians themselves think? It turns out they didn't think about lofty matters at all. For them, it was just work. They left almost no memoirs, didn't write diaries, didn't complain to journalists. Canadian military censorship was the strictest of all Allied armies. Letters home were read by officers. Pieces describing combat operations were cut out. Photographing was allowed only to official correspondence. The result? Almost complete silence. There was work. They did it. One of the few surviving documents, a letter from Private Jack MacDonald of the Canadian Scottish Regiment, written to his sister in December 1944. The letter reached the addressee only because the censor missed it by mistake. Quote, 44, simple lumberjack logic. A tree is in the way. Cut down the tree. A German is in the way. Remove the German. No philosophy. But for the Wehrmacht, in this simplicity was an entire philosophy of horror, a philosophy they themselves created but didn't expect to meet in Europe. The philosophy of total war that Germans themselves preached on the Eastern Front but didn't expect to encounter in the West. War without rules, without mercy, without humanity. Canadians didn't take prisoners after certain incidents, especially after the story with Kurt Meyer and his SS division Hitlerjugend. In June 1944, Meyer's SS men shot 45 Canadian prisoners of war at Ardennes Abbey near Caen, simply led them to the courtyard and shot them. Some were 19 years old. They surrendered after being wounded, expecting medical help. Instead of help, they got a bullet in the back of the head. When Canadians learned about this through French partisans, the order was simple and unofficial. With Hitlerjugend, no mercy. And they followed the order with the methodicalness of lumberjacks felling a tree. German soldier Franz Huber from the 12th SS Division, who survived the war and testified at the Nuremberg trials, told West German television in an interview in 1970, quote 45, and command understood this perfectly, moreover, tacitly approved. The official position of Canadian command: incidents are being investigated. The guilty will be punished. In practice, not a single Canadian soldier was convicted of war crimes on the Western Front because there was no evidence, because there were no witnesses, because Canadians cleaned up after themselves. British military investigator Major William Stewart, appointed by Allied command to investigate rumors of Canadian atrocities, wrote in a classified report in 1946, declassified only in 2003, quote, 46, cruelty? Perhaps, but the numbers spoke for themselves, and these numbers made Allied command turn a blind eye. Effectiveness was undeniable. Canadians achieved all set goals on schedule. Opened Antwerp on November 8, 1944, exactly 40 days after the operation began. Liberated Holland by May 45, crossed the Rhine in March, reached Germany first among Western Allies, lost fewer men per kilometer of conquered territory than Americans or British on comparable front sections. How? Because they killed faster and more mercilessly, because they didn't give the enemy time to react, to dig in, to prepare defenses, because they turned war into a slaughter where the strongest survives, not the noblest, because they treated war like work at a slaughterhouse. Unpleasant, dirty, but necessary. And did this work professionally, and the Wehrmacht tried to resist even with propaganda when other methods failed. German propaganda tried to use Canadian cruelty for its own purposes. Leaflets dropped over Canadian positions in autumn 44 screamed in broken English, "Canadian soldiers, you fight for Jewish bankers from London and New York. You kill German workers and peasants just like you. Your hands are in the blood of innocents. The German soldier is your class brother. Stop this slaughter." Canadians used these leaflets as toilet paper. Literally, rolls of paper in trenches ran out quickly, and German propaganda fell from the sky regularly. One Canadian officer, Captain Robert Monahan of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, During the interrogation of a captured German propagandist parachuted in to agitate Canadian troops, asked, "Tell me, why should I pity those who bombed London? Who sank our ships in the Atlantic with women and children on board? Who started this war by attacking Poland? Who shot our prisoners?" The German was silent. Monahan continued, "We didn't want this war. Canada is across the ocean. We don't care about your politics. But since we came, we'll finish it properly, and properly means quickly, and quickly means cruelly. Any objections?" Oh, there were no objections. The German propagandist was sent to a POW camp. He survived, unlike many others who fell into Canadian hands in hotter moments. And in spring came the denouement that showed how deeply the Wehrmacht feared Canadians, so much that they preferred capitulation to anyone except them. In spring 1945, the war was ending on all fronts. German soldiers surrendered by thousands, tens of thousands, entire divisions, but not to everyone. There were units that categorically refused to capitulate to Canadians, preferred to wait for Americans or British. German General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of the defense of Northern Holland, in April 45 sent a radiogram to Allied command, ready to discuss terms of surrender with British or American representative. "There will be no negotiations with Canadians. My soldiers prefer to continue resistance." Canadian General Charles Foulkes, commander of the 1st Canadian Corps, replied laconically through the same British liaison, "Then prepare for assault. We'll start tonight." Blaskowitz surrendered to the British in 3 days without waiting for night, because the alternative was a night visit from the water rats. And even facing the inevitable defeat of Germany, the prospect of meeting Canadians in the dark seemed worse than death. The war ended. But the story of the water rats didn't end there. It simply went into shadow. Deliberately, Canadians returned home in 45 and 46. Most were silent about what they saw and did. Leo Major returned to work as a longshoreman in Montreal, lived until 2000, never gave interviews, refused all awards. When his grandson asked if it was true that Grandpa was a hero, Major answered, quote, 53. Tommy Prince returned to Manitoba, where he faced racial discrimination. Indians weren't given work, weren't sold alcohol in bars, weren't allowed into hotels. A war hero decorated with 9 medals couldn't rent a room in Winnipeg, became an alcoholic, and passed away in poverty. In 1977, 7 people came to the funeral. Jack MacDonald opened a fish shop in Halifax and never told customers that during the war he took the lives of more than 40 people. When a local newspaper in the 80s tried to interview him for Remembrance Day, he refused. Quote, 54 Canada became a symbol of peace and politeness. The underscore, quote, underscore 55 underscore were forgotten, or pretended to be forgotten. Official history spoke of Canadian heroism, self-sacrifice, liberation of Europe. About the methods of this liberation was silence. But in Germany, they remembered, and this memory was passed from generation to generation like a scary tale. Wehrmacht veterans meeting at annual gatherings in the 50s, 60s, 70s drank schnapps and remembered. Not Stalingrad, though more Germans died there. Not the Kursk Bulge, though there the backbone of the Wehrmacht was broken, the Scheldt. Nights when Canadians came from darkness. Stories were passed to sons, grandsons, great-grandsons. Quote 5-6. And modern science tries to somehow explain this, find a rational kernel in irrational cruelty. Modern historians try to rethink the Canadian experience of World War II, hold symposiums, write dissertations, talk about the, quote, 57 of military ethics, that the line between heroism and war crime is blurred in conditions of total war, that victors write history, meaning Canadian cruelty was justified by results, that the Geneva Convention doesn't work when the opponent violates it themselves, that Canadians simply responded to German atrocities symmetrically, but Canadians themselves don't participate in these discussions. The last veterans are dying without leaving memoirs, because for them everything was simple. There was no, quote, 58, there was work, dirty, wet, bloody work, and they did it, not for glory, not for awards, not for history, to return home, and to return they needed to go through Germans. So they went through the shortest way, water rats, butchers in uniform, ghosts of the Scheldt, black devils, silent storm. Call them what you want, but the fact remains, In the history of World War II, there were no units the Wehrmacht feared more, not American Rangers storming machine gun nests in daylight under air cover, not British commandos attacking under fleet and artillery cover, not Soviet penal battalions going into attack in waves, but Canadians. Quiet, polite Canadians who came at night from the water with knives and entrenching tools and turned war into a slaughter, who didn't shout, didn't sing anthems, didn't raise banners, simply did the work, professionally, methodically, mercilessly. Kurt Meyer, that same SS officer who survived the war and served several years for war crimes in a Canadian prison, in his memoirs Grenadiers, published in 1957, wrote a phrase that Canadian military museums carefully ignore to this day. If Hitler had had an army consisting entirely of Canadians, we would have won the war in a year. Not because they're the best soldiers in a technical sense, but because they're the worst people on the battlefield. In a good sense, if such a sense exists at all in war, they kill like chopping wood, without emotions, without regrets, just work. And this work is done perfectly. Worst people, best soldiers, water rats. And the Wehrmacht was right when they feared them most of all, because you can fight against fanaticism, you can agitate against ideology, you can gather will against fear. But against people for whom war is simply work that needs to be done quickly and quality to return home to fishing and forest, against such people there is no defense. The Wehrmacht understood this too late. In November 1944, standing neck deep in the dirty water of the Scheldt, listening to bagpipes and looking into the darkness from which death silently crawled with a Canadian accent,